you can have a fixed proportion that you use that's either based on an estimate or based on a historical analysis of past data to do that. So examples of what each of those would look like is, if you're using a related metric, you might say we're going to split networking costs based on the number of accounts each team has, because the assumption would be that the more accounts you have, likely the more network costs you're incurring. Or the fixed proportional, you might do an analysis based on a sample month and use those proportions to build the cloud costs, the network costs, and you update those proportions at whatever schedule makes sense. It likely wouldn't be monthly, otherwise you could go to the last method, which is usage. And with usage, you're looking at the actual direct cost drivers, and you're matching this month's spend to this month's usage of those cost drivers. And so it is the most accurate way to do it for shared costs where it's possible or where it makes sense or where it is a variable cost with a direct cost driver that you can track. And that's when you would want to do it. It is a little bit harder. You do see this more in the run level. And however, even within some of these, on the slide I've got an example of what this might look like at the walk level to do it a usage-based allocation and what it might look like at a run level. So if we're looking at our internal support team's costs, a direct cost driver of that might be number of tickets. And so you could split the cost by the number of tickets per team, but not all ticket sizes, not all tickets are the same. Some take 2 minutes to solve, some take 2 days to solve. And so you could look at actual ticket times, and that would just be taking it to the next level. And so it's all about just finding what makes sense. You come up with your list of shared costs, and you go through each one and you evaluate what makes sense for this cost. And so these are some of the questions you ask as you're trying to decide which one makes sense. So how are the benefits distributed is one, and that's, again, more for fixed costs. If it's a variable cost, you're probably looking at the cost drivers. What is causing this spend? What would cause an increase or a decrease in spend? And that might be what you're using to allocate those costs. And then value added versus work required. With one of the previous examples, if you're trying to find a tiny shared cost that's way more work than it's worth, you might choose to not do it. Or you might choose to go with a simpler allocation method if a more detailed one is just too much work, more work than it's worth. Another interesting aspect of this, and this is something we ran into on the TBM team, is showback versus chargeback. When you're doing chargeback, you're going to get a lot more pushback, or at least we got a lot more pushback on how we're choosing to allocate these costs when you're doing chargeback. Because if you're doing an even split, but there's one team that's using lots of a resource and one team that's using none, the team that's using none is going to say, it doesn't make any sense that I'm paying the same amount as this other team because I'm not using it, and they're using all of it. With showback, we might still get some pushback on that, but it's less because since they don't have to pay for it, they don't care quite as much. But that's what we've seen is with chargeback, you have to be more careful. You have to use an approach that you can really stand behind and show that is the right approach, because you will get some pushback on it. And then it's possible that there are finance or accounting or policies or even legal requirements that force you to have to handle it a certain way. And so that's one of the first things you should probably figure out is if there are any finance, accounting, or legal requirements that make it so you have to handle them a certain way. So here are some things that we should consider when applying shared cost models. And the first thing is, it's not about just choosing one model that works for the whole business. It is looking at each individual cost and finding the method that works best for that specific shared cost. And then whether or not there are finance or accounting policies that apply to that shared cost, we want to make sure that we are aligned with finance and accounting, that they understand how we're splitting the cost, that it makes sense to them, that they're supportive of it, understand it, because they'll probably also get some questions about it. And then same with the business units, making sure that they understand that they are being charged for this. Something we did is before charging business units for something, if it was a new thing that we were going to start charging for, we would just show the cost back, and on the report it would say on this date we're going to start charging for it. That way they can plan for it, they understand what the costs are, and so it's communicated far in advance before we actually start charging them for it, and so they're expecting it. If people are hit with bills that they weren't expecting and they don't understand, and they don't know how that cost is being split to them, that's obviously going to cause more problems. And as you work through crawl, walk, and run, how that transition kind of works is often what you see is in the crawl level, you're using the less detailed, kind of more even split type methods. And as you move up to run, it becomes more of the specific direct cost driver type allocation methods. And at crawl, you're probably targeting just the biggest shared costs. And as you mature, you're starting to work on some of the smaller shared costs to get more coverage on your shared costs. And then with whatever you do, it's important to document it. Okay, so one last example that is specifically to cloud costs. Let's assume, so we're looking at support charges here. Let's assume we've got 4 teams who use cloud in our organization, and our monthly cloud bill is $100,000, and our support cost is 12% of whatever our cloud spend is. And so at $100,000 a month, that would be $12,000 if we had $100,000 in a month. So an even split method is pretty straightforward. It would be $3,000 a month to each team. Jumping to the other end, the usage method, here the cost driver is amount of cloud spend. If you are charged based on a percentage of your cloud spend, then obviously the more you spend, the more you pay. If team A were to be eliminated and they're not spending anything in cloud, their portion, the 12% of their spend goes away. And so anytime a team increases their cloud spend, the support cost increases proportionately to that. And so that is a very, very direct cost driver there. And so it's a simple example of what the direct cost driver would be in this situation. And so what it would look like in that usage-based method is just taking the percentage of the total cloud spend that everyone is spending and splitting the $12,000 in support charges proportionately based on that. And then that middle method, there are 2 different ways you could handle it. And one would be to say, whether it's maybe you don't, for whatever reason, maybe your tagging's not good, maybe you don't have what you need to be able to go to that usage-based in a reasonable way. And so you're either doing an estimate by team of what they spend on cloud, or maybe you're just doing a one-time analysis of historical data to say, this is how the breakout usually works between each team, and you're using that to split the support costs, which won't be exact, but it should be in the right direction, and you can update that over time. Or you could look at a different related metric and say, in general, we're seeing that the more applications you have in the cloud, the more your cloud spend is. And so we can't track your cloud spend, but we do know how many applications each team has. And so that's what we're going to use to split the costs between each team. And you use that to come up with the percentages. And again, this is something that you, at whatever cadence makes sense, update the ratios to make sure that it continues to be fair as each team's usage changes. And these are some things to think about when you are sustaining your approach. So you've put things in place, you're moving forward, maybe you're working toward the run level. Automation is always a good thing to have in place. And then moving, and this is in a sense part of automation, but moving shared costs to directly allocated, getting rid of shared costs. If anything can be directly allocated, then you don't have to worry about splitting it. So if that's a possibility, that's something to look into. And then looking into new shared costs or shared costs that go away, new applications that are coming on that shared costs need to be allocated to, or applications that are going away, just keeping it updated as both the shared costs and the applications using them change over time. And And then again, updating ratios if you're using that middle method that is not based on real data, updating those ratios over time to make sure they continue to be fair. So that's the general overview of what kind of things we think about when we're going through shared costs. There's a lot more detail in this in the FinOps Professional course. I put together the module for the FinOps Professional course on shared costs, and it goes into more detail on a lot of things. So I don't know if any of you guys have started doing that yet, but that's a place to learn more if you're interested in shared costs. There's a couple of chalk talks tomorrow that potentially are going to be, could potentially talk about shared costs. There's not one specific to shared costs, but the framework one could talk about basically anything. ITFM and TBM, everything technology business management does is it's very related to working with shared costs. And so, so if you're interested in learning more about that, you can join one of those. And
Q&A
are there any
time.
questions?
All right, right this way.
All right, so 2 parts. First, when you were putting together, or when you put together these, we'll call them formulas, did you find that the departments wanted you to explain the formulas specifically? And if so, were they resistant if they were complex? Meaning, you've got fixed costs, you've got variable costs, and a lot of things in life are fixed plus variable. But for somebody who's not a finance background like you or I, they don't really understand that. And so I wonder how complicated it was to explain it, how much pushback. And the other side of this is, as somebody who, behavioral economics background, when you put these systems in place, they also incentivize certain behaviors in the organization. So when you are putting together a structure like this, obviously, you've got fixed plus variable. So it's going to encourage some departments to either overspend, some to underspend, some to not spend at all. Have you gotten to the point where you're observing the changes in behavior based on that? Or, have you just not gotten that far yet?
So first of all, our cloud, like I said, our FinOps practice is in the crawl level. Tackling shared costs in our FinOps practice is Q4 of this year. We haven't even done that yet. So a lot of this comes from my experience from TBM and the work I've done to put together what our approach will be when we do tackle it for shared costs. We just haven't actually implemented that yet. But when it comes to TBM, I don't know if it's not that we handled it correctly or if this is going to happen anyway, but we definitely got pushback. And we had meetings where we looked at total cost of ownership reports, which basically took, here's the cost you're paying but here for your application, but here's all the costs other teams are paying for that benefit your application and with your portion allocated to you, and this is the total cost of your thing. And yeah, we got lots of pushback, lots of questioning, lots of people wondering why is that my cost? That doesn't make sense to me. And it seemed like no matter how good we think the formulas are or how logical they might be, people are going to have questions. And so I don't know if we necessarily handled that correctly, but I would say that the communication is a huge part of that, making sure that it is understood how you're doing it. I think if possible, and we tried to do this in some cases, putting right on the report what you're using to come up with that. You might put what the cost driver is. This is your cost, and it's based on your portion of the spend by this metric. And so I think that was helpful. Can you remind me what your second question was?
Incentives.
Okay, yeah, so that was the other interesting thing is we do some chargeback and some showback. And yeah, it's you have to be aware of what your organization's goals are. We use the term often directionally correct. There are some if we want people to move, if we want people to use a certain service, maybe we don't charge them for it because we want people going there. Where if we're moving off a certain application and there's a new application in place that most people are using, and there's this other application that costs a lot of money and only 2 teams are using it, yeah, we're going to charge them for that because they need to know that that is the cost that they're incurring for the organization by continuing to use that. We have to keep that going, where we would want to just retire that and move completely to the new one. And so yeah, that's definitely a big aspect, is thinking of what behavior you're trying to drive, and that can definitely influence what decision you make as far as shared costs, show back, charge back, things like that.
Parker, I was getting a little bit of a flashback when you were answering that question. Just, we don't always do things well when we're learning FinOps. And Julia Harvey, who's in the third row there, ducking her head, has worked for me on a few FinOps teams. And we pretty much, like, if you don't handle shared costs well, it can ruin and dive bomb your chargeback. Because you're putting those shared costs on top of your chargeback and you're not able to communicate and show transparency on how you're allocating those out, you're going to get pushback no matter what. But if you can at least show transparently and cleanly, woof, everything's under question then. And it's going to be real difficult to get the direct charges allocated out. So it's very good stuff. It's Mr. Schulman.
So Parker and I have worked on this before, so I'm sure appreciative of the lessons that I've learned from it. But I do have a question from your experience. Kind of what Joe just said, when you have direct costs that you can attribute fairly straight, but then you have either untagged or shared costs, so you're now doing a blended hybrid cost or whatever it is, do you refer to it as all-in hybrid? Do you call the shared as overhead? How do you socialize it so that what you can't directly correlate to what Joe was just saying, you don't lose credibility?
Again, I don't have experience doing this with cloud specifically, but with our other IT costs, I think I think we called it a shared portion of a cost. Yeah, there were some costs where we could directly allocate some of it, but some of it was shared. And yeah, they just would have 2 lines on there. That's how we handled it, is they would just have 2 lines, and it would be this cost direct and a this cost shared. And we'd probably get questions about that, and we'd have to answer them when reviewing those reports. But
We're out of time. Thank you very much, Parker.
thank you.
JR here from the FinOps Foundation. Thank you for watching. Please go to FinOps.org if you want to get plugged into this amazing community. And of course, hit subscribe right here on YouTube to get all the future content. Hope to see you soon.